There is a moment, and if you have lived long enough with your kindness mistaken for weakness, you already know the moment I mean. There is a moment when the softest person in the room goes quiet in a new way. Not the old quiet, not the quiet of biting your tongue, or swallowing the insult, or telling yourself, it's fine, they didn't mean it, I should be the bigger person. No, a different quiet, a quiet with a floor underneath it, and the one who has spent years feeding on that softness, who built a whole kingdom on the assumption that you would always absorb the blow and apologize for bleeding, that one does not see it coming. He cannot see it coming because he never once believed you were a person with a bottom to reach. He thought you were a well, and wells in his mind do not run dry. Tonight I want to talk about the day the well runs dry and why the one who drank from it for years will stand there, stunned, asking what happened, when the truth is that nothing happened. Everything simply arrived. I have spent a great deal of my life sitting with people in their darkest rooms, listening to the stories they were ashamed to tell in daylight, and I noticed something so consistent, so reliable, that I stopped calling it a coincidence and started calling it a law. The people who suffer the most quietly are, almost without exception, the people who feel the most loudly. They are not weak. This is the first lie we must bury tonight, and bury it deep because it has done more damage than almost any other lie about the human soul. The soft-hearted are not weak. The ones who cry at another's pain, who cannot walk past suffering without feeling it in their own chest, who lie awake replaying a stranger's bad day as though it were their own. These are not the fragile ones. They are, in fact, carrying the heaviest instrument in the room. A finely tuned instrument picks up every vibration. A cheap one picks up nothing at all and calls that peace. And here is the tragedy, the old and repeating tragedy that plays out in bedrooms and boardrooms and family dinners across every culture I have ever studied. The finely tuned instrument is almost always placed, sooner or later, in a room with someone who has no instrument at all, someone who has instead a mirror, and mirrors do not feel the music. They only reflect whoever is standing close enough to admire themselves in it. This is the shape of the wound I want to speak about tonight, not a shape unique to any one relationship, or any one family, or any one heartbreak, but a shape as old as the human psyche itself, playing out again and again like a myth that refuses to stop repeating because we refuse to stop needing to hear it. I do not use the word narcissist lightly, and I would ask you not to either, because the moment we turn a word into a weapon, we stop understanding what it was built to describe. A person who cannot see beyond the surface of himself is not simply vain. Vanity is a small, almost forgivable thing. A peacock admiring its own tail feathers in the sun. What I am describing is graver than vanity. It is a kind of blindness, a soul that has, for reasons buried so deep even he cannot excavate them, sealed off its own interior, bricked up the basement of his own being, so completely that he can no longer sense that other people have an interior at all. To him, you are not a person with a private world of your own. You are a surface, a function, a supply. And when a person becomes, in another person's eyes, nothing but a function, a light switch to be flipped on when needed and ignored when not, something happens to the soul of the one being used that the user never anticipates because the user was never paying attention to begin with. That something is what I have come here to talk about tonight. The turning, the snap, the moment the well runs dry. Let me tell you first about the ones who break slowly, because that is nearly all of you, and I want you to recognize yourselves before we go any further. You were the child who noticed when the room went tense before anyone said a word. You were the friend who remembered the birthday nobody else remembered, who showed up with soup when no one asked you to, who absorbed the sharp words of someone having a bad day and told yourself generously, they didn't mean it, they're just hurting. This is not a flaw in your character, this is a gift, and I want to be precise about that word, a gift in the oldest sense, the sense our ancestors meant when they spoke of gifts that come with a cost attached, because every gift of great power asks something of the one who carries it. Your gift was feeling, feeling deeply, feeling accurately, feeling what others could not even feel in themselves. And like every gift of consequence, it made you valuable to precisely the kind of person who cannot generate warmth on his own and must, therefore, find it in someone else and take it. Not borrow it, take it, because there was never any intention of paying it back. I want you to understand something about how this begins, because it never begins with cruelty. It never announces itself. If it announced itself, you would have run, and you are not a fool. Do not let anyone tell you that you stayed because you were a fool. You stayed because it began with charm. It began with someone who seemed, for a while, to be the one person who finally saw you, who mirrored your own light back at you so precisely that you mistook the reflection for recognition. This is the oldest trick in the architecture of this kind of soul, though I do not believe it is calculated in the way people imagine. It is not a villain twirling a mustache. It is something closer to instinct, the instinct of a creature who has learned, likely very young, likely in a childhood that starved him of something he never received, that the only way to feel whole is to attach to someone who already is whole and slowly, slowly drain her. You gave and it worked, so you gave more. That is the shape of it. That is always the shape of it. Not a single dramatic betrayal, but 1,000 small withdrawals from an account that was never being replenished. Your patience explained away his cruelty. Your empathy absorbed his coldness and turned it into a story where he was misunderstood and you were simply not trying hard enough. You built an entire cathedral of excuses to protect someone who never once, not once, built you so much as a shelter. And here is what he did not know, because he was never watching closely enough to know it. Every one of those withdrawals was being counted. Not by you. You were not counting, you were loving, which is a different arithmetic altogether, but by something older than your conscious mind. Something that keeps its own books whether you want it to or not. Call it the deep self. Call it the soul, if that word does not embarrass you. It was counting the whole time, and it does not send warnings the way the mind does. It does not nag you the way a friend might. It waits. It waits with a patience that would terrify you if you understood how absolute it is. And then, on some ordinary Tuesday, over something that looks laughably small from the outside, a forgotten promise, a dismissive laugh, a single sentence spoken in the wrong tone at the wrong moment, the account closes. I have sat across from men and women in the wreckage of this exact moment, and I want to describe it to you honestly because the myths we tell about it are almost all wrong. We imagine the breaking point as an explosion, shouting, slammed doors, thrown plates. Sometimes it is, but far more often, and far more devastatingly for the one who caused it, the snap is silent. It is stillness. It is the empath, the feeler, the giver looking at the narcissist for what feels like the first time with entirely dry eyes. No tears, no pleading, no more stories invented to protect him from the truth of what he is. Just a terrible, clean clarity, the way a fever breaks, and suddenly the room looks exactly as cold as it always actually was. This is the moment he never sees coming, and I want to explain to you precisely why, because understanding the why is what will set you free from ever mistaking his shock for remorse. He does not see it coming because he was never looking at you, not truly. He was looking at his own reflection in your devotion, and a reflection, by its very nature, does not have moods of its own. It does not grow tired. It does not have a private inner weather system, building storms out of sight. So when the reflection finally does something no reflection is supposed to do, when it turns, when it walks toward the door, when it says the four words that end everything, I am done now, he does not experience this as the natural foreseeable consequence of years of extraction. He experiences it as betrayal, as if the mirror had committed a crime against the man who has been staring into it his whole life. This is why you will often hear, in the aftermath, some version of the same bewildered question. I don't understand. Everything was fine. Everything was not fine. Everything was fine. For him, that is the distinction that changes everything. And I want you to hold on to it the way you would hold on to a lit match in a dark room. His experience of the relationship and your experience of the relationship were never the same relationship. He was living inside a story where you existed to reflect his significance back to him. You were living inside a story where you slowly, quietly disappeared. Now I could stand here and tell you a simple story about villains and victims, and it would feel good for a moment, the way sugar feels good for a moment. But I did not come here to give you sugar. I came here to give you something that will actually nourish you, and that requires me to say something harder, something I have learned to say only after decades of sitting with human suffering. The snap, when it finally comes, is not only about him, it is about the part of you that you handed to him in the first place. I do not say this to shift the blame. Hear me on this, because it would be easy to hear it wrong. The responsibility for cruelty belongs entirely to the one who is cruel. He built nothing, he only took. That is his account to settle in this life or in whatever reckoning comes for all of us in the quiet hours before sleep, and it is not yours to carry on his behalf. But there is a second story running underneath the first one, a story about you, and it is the story I actually want to spend the rest of our time together on, because it is the only story you have any power to change. You were taught, likely very early, likely by people who loved you clumsily rather than cruelly, that your worth was measured by how much you could give away. Perhaps you were the child who kept the peace in a house that had none. Perhaps you were praised again and again for being easy, for being good, for being no trouble at all. And only later, much later, did you understand what a dangerous kind of praise that is. Because a child who is loved for being no trouble learns a brutal equation. That love is the reward for disappearing your own needs. And a soul that learns to disappear its own needs will spend the rest of its life being drawn, as if by gravity, toward people who are delighted to let it. This is the part of the wound that has nothing to do with him at all. This is the old wound, the first wound, the one that was open long before he ever walked through the door. He did not create your capacity to abandon yourself for the comfort of others. He only found it the way water finds a crack in stone, not out of malice particularly, but because that is simply what water does when it discovers an opening. So let us speak honestly at last about what the snap actually is, because I do not want you to walk away from tonight thinking it is merely an act of rage, or an act of revenge, or even an act of justice, though it may feel like all three in the moment. The snap, understood at the deepest level, is the moment the disappeared self refuses to stay disappeared any longer. Think of the psyche as a house with many rooms, some of them lit, some of them long shut and dark. For years, for as long as this dynamic has owned you, you have been living entirely in the front room, the room with the windows facing outward, the room built for hosting guests and managing their moods and keeping the furniture arranged exactly as they like it. And down a long hallway, behind a door you stopped opening because opening it hurt too much, there has been another room, a room with your own name on it, a room holding every need you postponed, every boundary you excused away, every flash of anger you swallowed and called overreacting, every quiet scream you turned, instead, into another act of service. That room does not vanish because you ignore it. Nothing that belongs to the soul vanishes simply because it is inconvenient. It waits, it accumulates. And when the door finally opens, because it always, eventually, opens, what comes out is not petty, and it is not small, and it is not Whatever he tries to tell you afterward, crazy, what comes out is proportional. It is exactly as large as everything that was denied entry, for exactly as long as it was denied entry. This is why the snap so often shocks even the empath herself. She did not know she was carrying that much. She did not know the room was that full. She only knew the way you know a storm is coming from the particular color of the sky, that something in her had reached its absolute limit and would not be talked back down from it, not this time, not by him, not by anyone. I want to say something now about anger, because I know some of you were raised to believe that anger is the opposite of love, or the opposite of goodness, or proof that you have somehow failed at being the gentle person you always tried to be. I want to dismantle that belief tonight, completely, because it has kept too many good people trapped in rooms they should have left years ago. Anger is not the opposite of love. Anger, when it finally arrives after long suppression, is love's last desperate act of self-defense. It is the psyche's way of saying, I have tried tenderness, and tenderness was mistaken for permission. I have tried patience, and patience was mistaken for endlessness. I have tried understanding, and understanding was mistaken for agreement. There is nothing left to try but the truth, spoken plainly, with the full weight of everything I did not say for years behind it. This is not a fall from grace. I want to say that again because it matters more than almost anything else I will tell you tonight. The snap is not the empath failing to be good. It is the empath, for the first time in a very long time, refusing to sacrifice her own soul on the altar of someone else's comfort. That is not a collapse. That is an arrival. Now let us return to him, because I promised to explain why he never sees it coming, and I have only given you half the answer. The other half is darker, and I think you deserve to hear it plainly rather than softened. He does not see it coming because, on some level, he will never consciously admit, he does not believe you are fully real. I do not mean this as an exaggeration for effect. I mean it with the same clinical precision I would use to describe any other feature of the human psyche. There is a kind of person wounded in a particular way, usually very early, usually by a caregiver who either worshipped him conditionally or abandoned him coldly, sometimes both, who never develops what I would call object constancy for other souls. That is a heavy phrase, so let me put it simply. He never learned to hold another person in his mind as a complete being with her own inner world, her own private griefs, her own limits, existing independently of what she can provide him in any given moment. To such a person, you are less like a second character in the story and more like weather, useful when it is pleasant, irritating when it is not, but not in his deepest architecture, a sovereign being who might one day simply decide she is finished being rained on by his moods. This is why, when you finally leave, or finally go cold, or finally set the boundary that ends everything, his first reaction is so rarely reflection, and so overwhelmingly, predictably, disbelief. not disbelief that he hurt you. He was never tracking that closely enough to know the extent of it, but disbelief that the weather has, against all his unconscious expectations, learned to leave the sky. He will call you cruel. He will call you cold. He will, if he is skilled in this particular art, try to summon the version of you that always came back, the version trained since childhood to interpret someone else's collapse as her own responsibility to fix. And here is where I want to plant something in you tonight that I hope takes root and grows into an oak. That version of you is allowed to stay gone. She does not owe him a resurrection. The kindest thing you can do for the deep, disappeared self who finally spoke, the one who finally said, "No more," is to let her words stand unretracted, even when the silence afterward feels unbearable. Especially then, I want to tell you something about what happens after the snap, because the ending is not actually the end, and I do not want to leave you standing at the door without a map for what comes next. There is a grief that follows, and it is a strange, disorienting grief, because you are not only grieving him, you may not, in fact, grieve him very much at all once the fog clears. You are grieving the version of yourself who believed so faithfully for so long that if she only tried hard enough, gave enough, understood enough, she could love someone into becoming capable of loving her back. That belief was not stupidity. It was the most beautiful kind of faith a person can hold, misapplied to a soil that could never grow anything in return. Grieving the loss of that faith is not weakness. It is the tuition you pay for wisdom, and it is, I promise you, cheaper than the alternative, which is paying it again and again with someone new, wearing a different face, but running the exact same hunger. And there is something else that happens after the snap, quieter than grief, that I want you to watch for, because it is easy to miss if you are not looking. There is a return, not immediately, not without work, but a return slowly to the rooms in that long hallway you had shut for years. You start to notice what you actually want for dinner rather than what keeps the peace. You start to notice when a sentence someone speaks to you lands wrong, and instead of translating it instantly into your own fault, you let it simply sit there, uncomfortable, exactly where it belongs on the person who said it. You start, in other words, to become whole, not healed in the sense of returning to some innocent state before the wound. There is no such return, and I would not wish it on you even if there were, because that innocence was also blindness, whole in a new sense, a wholeness that includes the wound, integrates it, carries it as knowledge, rather than as an open door for anyone hungry enough to walk through. This is the great secret gift hidden inside the worst relationship of your life, and I do not say this to excuse what was done to you. Nothing excuses it, but to make sure it was not entirely wasted. The very dynamic that nearly consumed you is also the dynamic that finally taught you where your edges are. You did not know your own boundaries because you had never been forced to find them. You do now. And a person who knows her own boundaries the way she knows the shape of her own hand, cannot be quietly consumed by anyone ever again, because consumption depends entirely on the victim not noticing the meal being made of her, one polite sacrifice at a time. Let me say something now to anyone listening who is still inside it, still in the front room, still managing the moods, still telling yourself the story where he is misunderstood, and you simply have not yet found the right combination of patience and love to unlock the person you know somewhere must be in there. I understand that story. I have heard it 1,000 times in 1,000 voices, and I want to tell you the truth as gently and as firmly as I know how. You cannot love someone into having an interior life they have not yet built for themselves. That is not your task. It was never your task. No matter how many times you were told, implicitly, by a childhood or a culture or a fear of being alone, that a good woman, a good man, a good soul stays and fixes and endures. Staying is not always love. Sometimes staying is only fear wearing the mask of loyalty. And the moment you can tell the difference, really tell it, in your body, not just in your intellect, is the moment the door down that long hallway starts on its own to creak open. You do not have to wait for a dramatic betrayal to give yourself permission to leave. That is another lie this culture tells too often, that suffering must reach some cinematic threshold before it counts, before it justifies your exit. It does not. The slow starvation of your own spirit, spread quietly over years of small dismissals, is every bit as real a wound as any single catastrophic blow, and it deserves exactly as much of your protection. I want to close tonight with something about the nature of the self, because I believe this entire story, the empath, the narcissist, the snap that neither saw coming in quite the way it arrived, is really a story about one thing beneath all its costumes, the return of a person to her own center. There is a center in every human being, a quiet, steady core that exists prior to any relationship, any wound, any story someone else tells about who you are supposed to be for them. Most of us spend enormous portions of our lives orbiting somewhere far outside that center, caught in the gravity of other people's needs, other people's moods, other people's hunger. This is not a failure of character. It is, I think, simply the condition of being young in soul, however old we may be in years. We have to be pulled far enough from center to even notice, by contrast, that a center exists at all. The relationship that nearly broke you, the one that trained you to disappear a little more each year, that mistook your bottomless capacity for love as a bottomless capacity for abuse. That relationship, as much as I wish it upon no one, is very often the exact force required to fling you far enough from your own gravity that you finally look back and see the center you had abandoned. And once you have seen it, truly seen it, the way you see a lighthouse after years of navigating by guesswork alone, you cannot fully forget it again. You can drift, you can forget for a season, but some part of you now knows the way home, and that knowledge, once earned, is never entirely lost. This is why I do not want you to think of the snap, when it finally comes, as an ending only. It is also, and I would ask you to sit with this until you actually believe it, not just until you understand it intellectually, a birth, a hard, ungentle, entirely necessary birth of the self that had been waiting patiently in that BAM for the door to finally open. She is not a stranger. She is not someone new. She is you, the fuller version, the one who existed before the world taught you that your worth was measured in how much of yourself you could give away without complaint. So if you are standing tonight at the edge of your own well, feeling how low the water has gotten, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes from being endlessly drawn from by someone who has never once, not once, offered to fill you back up, I want you to know that the dryness you feel is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof that something true is finally rising to the surface. The well is not broken. The well has simply, at long last, remembered that it is allowed to run dry for someone who never intended to replenish it. And when you finally speak the 4 words, "I am done now," do not be surprised by the silence that follows, or the shock on his face, or the disbelief in his voice that anything could possibly have changed between two people who, in his mind, were only ever one story. His. Let him be shocked. His shock is not evidence that you were wrong. It is evidence that he was never really looking. You do not owe your entire unraveling to a person who never once noticed you were being unraveled. Instead, back down that long hallway. Open every door you were once too tired, too obligated, too afraid to open. Sit in every room. Grieve what needs grieving. And I promise you, it will not take as long as you fear, because grief, unlike him, never lies to you about how much it actually needs from you before it lets you go, and then walk back out into the front room, not as the host managing everyone else's comfort, but as the one for whom the house was always quietly actually built. That is the whole of what I came here to tell you tonight. Not a story about villains and victims, though there is villainy and there is victimhood woven through every telling of it. A story, instead, about the day the disappeared self stops apologizing for taking up space and simply, finally, comes home.